So many of you have heard me talk about this topic that so many people think they're stuck because they have the wrong strategy or tactics in their life. And strategy and tactics will only get you so far. So often I don't think this is the root cause because strategy and tactics are kind of going on to the next thing. It's like, well, if this isn't working, I'm going to shift here. I'm going to change my focus. I'm going to change my strategy. I'm going to change the tactic in the way that I'm going to get there. But what really keeps people stuck is a combination of emotional triggers, behavioral patterns, and environmental conditioning. And so many people say, wait, so how do I start to understand what my triggers are? How do I start to understand what my behavioral patterns are? And how do I put myself in a position where I can start to understand them, make sure that they don't manifest in a way that negatively impacts my life, and so that I can start to identify and move through them in a way that they don't negatively impact my life, and in fact, probably aren't even present the majority of the time any longer. And this is typically connected to negative emotions, fear, shame, scarcity, anxiety, you name it. Something on the negative side of the emotional spectrum that makes us feel bad, that makes us feel yucky, that makes us feel stuck. And so we have to be able to become aware of these things so that we can start to move through them and be intentional with them. The thing about negative emotions is sometimes they're deep, like really deep. Right? When I say that we're a combination of our emotional triggers, behavioral patterns, and environmental conditioning, that environmental conditioning starts the day we're born. And so if we grew up in an environment that has conditioned us to be fearful, if we grew up in an environment that conditioned us to have shame, if we grew up in an environment that conditioned us to have anger or fear or scarcity, well, then those are going to be things that are really embodied in who we are in certain ways, but they're going to have massive negative impacts in our lives. No wonder we want to break free of them. No wonder we feel stuck by them. But I want to say something to you before we even get through this process, because you need to understand this. Many of these emotions, you don't ever escape. There is no shutting them off in a healthy way. There is only moving them into a place of awareness so you can be intentional with them, redefine patterns, breaking old ones and creating new ones. And then having that habit start to compound on itself to the point where the wounds and the damage from those negative emotions aren't as present in our day-to-day. These emotions will always be adversaries in constant pursuit, which means you have to be vigilant in your efforts to understand where you're stuck, understand the things that have been driving you, keeping you stuck, and understand the things that might have negative impacts in your life. Once we do that, we get ahead of it, we start to become more free. And that's what we're all after. So there's a few steps that we're going to walk through here. The first is we have to understand what the negative emotion is that's impacting us. And sometimes this is hard because we can be blind to them. We may not know that they exist in our life. We may not know that our actions, behaviors, thoughts, feelings are shaped by these negative emotions and the narratives that are created intellectually and emotionally by them. I'll tell you, shame is one that impacted me for a very, very long time. Still does. But I didn't even know it was there. And so it wasn't until I understood what shame was and how it was showing up in my life that I was able to start to understand that I actually have been impacted by shame. I've been stuck by shame. I've changed who I am because of shame. So we have to identify the emotion first. Second, we have to identify the root or the roots of this negative emotion. Now this part's a little bit harder for a couple of reasons. Particularly if you've lived on this planet for 30, 40, 50 years, you've got 30, 40, 50 years of conditioning. So sometimes to go back and find the needle in the haystack on the one thing that caused the root of it might seem a little daunting, and we may not uncover it right away. But getting to the root or roots, or at least directionally accurate on the roots or roots, is going to be essential for us to start to move through the process even further. So, you could look at something like fear, and you may have grown up in a household with overprotective parents. You may not see it that way because it was just so conditioned and normal to be fearful and operate in this state. So once you identify fear is there, then you can also go back and look at in your first 7, 10, 11, 14 years of life, you've actually been conditioned a certain way based on the beliefs, actions, and behaviors of your parents and the environment you were in. Now, what if on top of that you'd gone to another school that was really conditioned to make sure that safety was the number one priority and that we don't take big chances and that we just take calculated risks and we follow the letter of the law in everything that we do because risks cause errors and failures. Well, guess what? Fear of failure, fear of risk, fear of stepping out of the known path starts to then become conditioned in us even further. Understanding this is really critical because you need to understand the actions, behaviors, and emotions that shaped this negative emotion in your life before you can start to move it into a place where you see it for what it is, how it's impacted you, and what to do on a future-focused and objective perspective to move forward and through it. Critical step. Once you have identified the emotion and now you've identified the root or roots of the emotion, next we need to start to understand where and how does this show up in our body and our minds. What do we feel? What is the manifestation of this emotion in our body? Literally. Do we get a visceral reaction? Do we get a heat flush over our body? Do the veins on our necks start to pop out because all of a sudden our blood pressure is rising? Do we start to feel the veins popping out of our neck because of the blood pressure and the intensity that we're going to be moving through it? Do we get lightheaded? Does our heart rate increase or decrease? Do we start to sweat? Do our palms get sweaty? Literally look at all of these little things and how do they actually show up in your body? Because if you're listening, your body's going to tell you that something's there. You know, we often talk about pain pointing us at what's important, pain giving us perspective. These negative emotions create feelings within our body that in some way are our body calling for a cry for help. It's almost like we're in pain because we're experiencing them and our body's saying, hey, listen, slow down and listen. Most often though, we don't. We just shove it down. We put a smile on, tell ourselves that we're strong, we're good, we're capable, and we just keep moving. So we have to start to understand how these things move into our body so that we can start to understand how often we've either been actively suppressing or passively suppressing the way these emotions show up in our body so that we can just move through them. I did that with shame for a long time. I ignored the signs. I wasn't paying attention to the feedback that my body was giving me. And once I started to identify what this felt like, it made it a lot easier to start to move through it. Because then you get to understand what triggers you to feel those ways. Now with shame, because it's so hairy, it can actually manifest in your body different ways depending on different triggers. So for example, I might get triggered by someone who tells me that I'm too loud or I talk too fast. Because those are so core a part of who I am that when someone says that, I receive it as shame because it's basically telling me that who I am isn't good enough. And I know that's not what they're meaning. But that's how I receive it. That's how my body responds to it. So that is one of those things that is a shame trigger for me. And I caught myself after understanding the shame trigger almost shaming someone else for the exact same thing later in my life. Really important to understand how these show up. On the flip side, my shame shows up as defensiveness in my marriage. My wife might say one comment about how I missed something this last week with being a dad or being a husband. And because being a dad and a husband are so important to me, so critical to me, so deeply ingrained in who I am and what I believe in, that I receive that as a shame trigger. I'm not good enough as a husband or a father. And so I quickly trip into defensiveness, and I can list the 10 things that I've done in the last few days to show up as a husband and a father, to show that it's a priority, to show that I'm giving these things. When in reality, that's not at all what she was getting at. And the one comment about potentially an opportunity to improve or change, which is in alignment with who I am to constantly evolve and grow, can actually quickly put me back into a place where I'm defensive and trying to justify that what I've done already is good enough, when that wasn't ever her intent. We have to understand these critical 4 steps. Understanding the type of pain and emotion that you're dealing with. Being able to understand the root or roots of that emotion. Then starting to understand how does that emotion actually manifest in your body, and also in your body in different scenarios with different triggers. Because the next step is we have to start to be able to understand what triggers us. So that in those moments we can ask ourselves the question, is my reaction to this moment true? Am I reacting based on what's right in front of me, or am I reacting based on an emotional trigger and a behavioral pattern in how I react to that trigger in a way that might not have anything to do with what's in front of me? So instead of me getting angry and defensive because I forgot to load the dishwasher, or because my wife asked me to load the dishwasher a different way, what it's really doing is not being triggered by what's in front of me or what she's saying or even what she's asking me to do. It's triggering me based on something way back in my life about how maybe I wasn't loading the dishwasher good enough consistently. Now, I just made that example up, but that is a common one in households. So in those moments, we have to start asking ourselves, is this true? Is this relevant to the moment right now, or is it relevant based on a historical past pattern or a certain place or person that actually triggers this shame or negative emotion? And when we start to be able to do that, we can pause in those moments and choose a different path when the answer to the question is that it's not true. When the answer to the question is that this is deeply triggering for me, but it's not relevant to what's in front of me. It allows us to pause, take a deep breath, and choose a different path. What that starts to do is simultaneously break down old patterns. Literally break cycles that have existed in your life multiple times. And it starts to define new ones, potentially healthier ones if you're very intentional. And just by doing that, you start to continue to free yourself, because what you are unaware of, you cannot be intentional with. We know that our minds process 11 million bits of information per second, but we're only consciously aware of about 40. So what that says is that we're largely led by the unconscious. So until we go through a systematic process to move the unconscious to the conscious, the unaware to the aware, of course it's going to feel like life is fate, like we're a victim, like we have no influence or control over our destiny. But again, it's not about the strategy and tactics in your life that are keeping you stuck, that are keeping you stymied in your efforts to fulfill your potential, to keep you from being exactly who you are, and really who you were before the world told you who to be, your most authentic self. We know that's where magic happens, and perspective, motivation, and direction start to come into play. That's where joy, freedom, and fulfillment start to enter into your life. So this is all I'm encouraging you to do, is to start to pay attention that it's not about the external strategy and tactics. It's about the internal, emotional triggers, behavioral patterns, and environmental conditioning. Everything begins and ends with you. So when people ask me, how do you start to identify these triggers? How do you redefine behavioral patterns? That's about as short and succinct of a path as I can give you without specific examples in your life. But that is how we start to break cycles, break free, become unbridled, and live a life with no limits. So hopefully this was valuable for you. And if you need any help breaking this down, you can email me directly at brian@brianbogert.com. You can also email info@brianbogert.com, where we've got a couple of team members who are checking that email account. And if you'd like to evaluate resources, options, one-to-one, group, or courses that might help you understand how to identify these things in your life so you can become free, so you can become exactly who you are and want to be, just let us know how we can help. We're here for you.